Good evening and welcome. I'm Brent Criswell. I'm pastor here at Mesa Verde United Methodist Church. It's great to see everyone here this evening. I'd love to see it look like this on Sunday mornings. I told a few people that this is like church. If you come late, you can sit in the front row. So there are a few more places in the choir loft. Those of you who are standing, if you'd like to come on up, feel free. Kind of gives you a front row seat. So again, welcome. It's great to have everyone here this evening, and it's our pleasure from Mesa Verde United Methodist Church to host this event.
So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this election forum. I am the Reverend Sean Wilshire, and I proudly serve the Orange Coast Unitarian Universalist Church, which is just down the street. Brent and I are neighbors. And I'm just very excited to be here. I'm going to give you a little background and a little bit about the rules of what we're doing this evening. So there are, as you know, lots of debates and presentations and forums from candidates that run up to Election Day. We thought there was a need for a forum that looks at some of the issues that are important to the faith community as well. We're not looking for a debate, but wanted an opportunity to hear from both candidates' views on certain subjects. And as you may know, churches cannot endorse candidates one way or the other without risking their nonprofit status. This is federal law. We have worked hard to make this a nonpartisan event, and the questions are hopefully nonpartisan. The churches are allowed, however, to take stands on issues, right? And that is what we're asking the candidates to do this evening. Our hope is that people will walk out tonight with a better understanding of the positions of the candidates, and we can share those positions with those in our congregations, our friends, and our families. To give you a little background, a planning team from multiple congregations has been meeting weekly since June to prepare for this evening, so this is the culmination of a lot of hard work. And now, as you can imagine, finding a date where both candidates are available and which is convenient for the community is a very significant challenge. We selected this week because the House of Representatives is not in session, and it's early enough in the fall campaign so that the results can be shared broadly. Unfortunately, when setting dates, we landed on Yom Kippur, the very last day of Yom Kippur, which is an important Jewish holiday. And our apologies to members of the Jewish community for this choice. And we want you to know we are sharing this with a greater community on Facebook and other social media, and you can see more information about that in the order of service that you were given. That's what we call them in church, right? Orders of service. The planning team identified issues that are important to the faith community to bring before the candidates, and they narrowed them down to 5 for this evening. The first is public safety or gun violence. The second is homelessness, affordable housing. The third is healthcare and women's health. Fourth is climate change, and the fifth is immigration. 5 teams were then created, each taking one of the subject areas. Now, each of these 5 teams will have 3 minutes to give a little background information on their issue so that everybody's kind of up to speed, and then present a question to the candidate. These questions were shared with both campaigns 2 weeks ago. We want you to know that both candidates were invited by mail and email in early August. The invitations were followed up with emails and phone calls. Representative Rohrabacher, it would seem, has chosen not to respond, which I know is really disappointing for everybody. We really want to make this a welcoming place for everybody here and to hear all sides. You laugh, but it's true. We had hoped that he would see this as a forum, as a way to reach out to his constituents. But with only one candidate present tonight, we will continue with our prepared presentations and questions and expand the answer period from 3 minutes, was what we told them, to 4 minutes if he so chooses. In an effort to continue to be fair to both candidates, we have collected statements on the selected topics, which are available as you leave in the back of the church. If there is time remaining, we will ask Mr. Rouda to respond to questions from the audience. So if you have a question not being addressed, please write it down on a card. Hopefully you were given when you first came in here. Or if you don't see one of the ushers holding up, hold up your hand and they will get you a card. So, and when you've got it written out, again, flag it up and they'll pick it up, right? We also think that if Mr. Rouda is able, that you can ask questions in a more informal environment. There will be nice refreshments afterwards out on the patio. We ask that you remember as Brent said, where you are, right? This is a church. And in that spirit, we ask everyone to be respectful and kind in all of the questions that we do. We come in the spirit of nonpartisanship and hope that you will too. We also ask that you hold any applause until the end and not to make any rude noises should you not agree with something. Because remember, again, church, right? This is where we practice the best of who we are, right? It's simple hospitality and kindness. So all of our time is very valuable. We have a very tight agenda tonight. We plan to finish at 8:30 p.m. And to keep us on schedule, we have a timekeeper, our wonderful Miss Verde Reed, who will let the speakers know when they have 1 minute left and 15 seconds left and when time has run out. If someone chooses to continue past time, we will shut off their mic. I love you too. This standard goes for candidates and for presenters tonight. After the initial 5 questions, we will determine if we have time for additional questions and a 3-minute closing statement from Mr. Rouda. Once again, we're not taking questions from the floor unless they're presented in written form, so please write them out. At 8:25 p.m., we will present a short summary of the meeting and next steps. All right, if this agenda and all these rules are acceptable to you, please respond by saying aye. Aye. Awesome, I'm holding you to that. So as you know, we have 2 candidates for the 48th Congressional seat here in California. Dana Rohrabacher is a 30-year member of the U.S. House of Representatives. In the 1970s, he worked as a journalist and columnist for the Orange County Register. From 1981 to 1988, he served as a speechwriter and special assistant to President Reagan. He is married to Rhonda, and they have 3 children and live in Costa Mesa. Mr. Harley Rouda is a businessman, philanthropist, attorney, and tech entrepreneur. After working for one of the country's largest law firms, he joined his family's real estate business. He also helped launch 3 tech companies. This is his first run for public office. He lives in Laguna Beach with his wife, Kara, and they have 4 children. Thank you, Mr. Rouda, for being here. And with that lovely warm welcome, we will begin with our first issue area, public safety and gun violence. Our presenter, please step forward.
Hi, I'm Pibini. Good evening. So we are all shocked and horrified by the increasing number of mass shootings in public spaces. Almost a year ago, on October 1st, 59 people were killed and more than 500 were injured at a concert in Las Vegas. And here in Orange County, in a Seal Beach hair salon, on October 12, 2011, 9 people were shot and only 1 survived. As members of the faith community, we feel the urgency to address this problem. It is morally reprehensible that our society is not doing enough to decrease the violence. The idea that we can be in the wrong place at the wrong time and die in a mass shooting can be terrifying. We all want better public safety for ourselves and our loved ones. The Parkland students from Florida, who were directly affected by a mass shooting earlier this year, have been traveling around the country demanding change. They were in Irvine about 2 months ago. Some of their suggestions are universal background checks, close the loopholes that allow unlicensed sellers to sell guns without background checks, ban semi-automatic rifles that fire high-velocity rounds, ban accessories like bump stocks that simulate automatic weapons, establish a database of gun sales and background checks, raise the age of legal gun buying to 21. A large percentage of mass shooters are mentally ill or under the influence of drugs. In an LA Times article on February 23, 2018, it was reported that between the years of 1900 and 2017, 59% of the 185 public mass shootings were carried out by people who had been diagnosed with mental illness or demonstrated signs of mental illness prior to the attack. This is another level that needs to be addressed. Ending gun violence is a complicated issue that requires more research and a variety of solutions. Other developed countries do not have this problem to the extent that we have it here in the US, so there are solutions out there. The time for thoughts and prayers are over. Now is the time for action. On that note, our question is, what do you feel is Congress's role in responding to increasing deaths from gun violence? And if you were elected, how would you address this crisis at the federal level? Mr. Rouda?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for all of you for coming out here tonight. I wish I was here to have a debate with the other candidate, but I certainly am proud to be here and humbled to be here with you and afforded the opportunity to answer these questions. The mass shooting in Las Vegas really came home for us here in Southern California. 1/4 of the 500 plus people who were either murdered or injured were from Southern California. And as you pointed out, we have the mass shooting in Seal Beach. An individual very near and dear to me, Beth, who's on our team helping out, is the sister of one of the individuals who was killed, and her mother was also a victim. Since 1968, there have been more deaths by handguns in the United States through murder and suicide than every death in the history of our country since the Revolutionary War on our battlefields. I'd like you to let that sink in. Every battle since the Revolutionary War, every war since the Revolutionary War, the people who have died on the battlefield fighting for our freedom do not add up to the carnage we have caused each other since 1968. We have an epidemic. So the question is, how do we address this epidemic? Well, fortunately, these kids from Parkland are doing a great job of getting this message out, that there are those among us, a majority of us, who believe that basically what California has enacted would be good for the entire country. And that is 10-day waiting periods. That is background checks for all gun purchases, including those that are private sales as well as flea markets, gun shows, and so on. The elimination of assault rifles, the elimination of high-capacity magazines, the elimination of gun sales to those who are on the no-fly list, and making sure that there's permitting and licensing for guns. Now, I will tell you, I support the Second Amendment. It is part of our Constitution. But the Second Amendment, as all amendments under the Bill of Rights and all rights under the Constitution, are limited rights. Justice Antonio Scalia, that liberal justice, once said that the rights under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are limited. The right to bear arms does not mean that you can carry any gun, anytime, anywhere you want. So we, as Americans, have a right to have common sense legislation to help eliminate gun violence in our country. Thank you.
I'm Eva Goodwin-Noriega, as you possibly caught before. Every day we see the evidence of increasing homelessness throughout our communities. How can we best address this situation? Government officials and private agencies recognize that the policy with the biggest payoff is housing first. Our federal government, in fact, has 3 programs that have been particularly successful in doing just that. Program number 1, perhaps the best known, is the Section H voucher system offered since 1974 by the Housing and Urban Development Department, or as it's commonly known, HUD. Via a Section 8 voucher, the property owner is guaranteed to be paid the full market rent. How? The low-income renter pays 30% of his or her income towards the rent, and the federal government, us, the taxpayers, pays the rest. For a number of years, however, the need for vouchers has far outstripped the supply. In fact, we usually hear about a 10-year wait, and sometimes the waiting list closes down entirely. I've personally experienced this in hunting for HUD housing here in Orange County for my sister who has paranoid schizophrenia. The list was 10 years long. The second program, the newer program, is known as VASH, which stands for Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing. It also provides housing vouchers, but specifically for veterans. Since VASH's inception, the number of homeless veterans nationally has dropped by 45%. Yet, in spite of its effectiveness with veterans, in January of this year, VASH vouchers were nearly eliminated entirely from the federal budget. The third program is called HOME, officially the Home Investment and Partnership Program. The HOME program has offered money since 1992 for cities to use as they see fit. With HOME monies, a city can buy, rebuild, or rehab housing for its low-income people. The program is designed to help a community increase the supply of affordable housing stock, thus attacking a critical supply-demand imbalance. The level of funding for HOME has ranged from a high of $2 billion in 2004 to the current level of less than half that amount. In summary, we've been told recently that our economy has never grown this fast nor never been this healthy. Try telling that to the more than 500,000 people living on the streets and riverbeds, or in the shelters or cars, or surfing friends' couches, or sheltering for a few days with a motel voucher. So, our questions for you are these. How will you support and expand federal programs such as Section 8, VASH, and HOME that have proven to be effective both in keeping people housed and in saving taxpayers' money? And how will you go about convincing your constituents that solutions offered by programs such as these are in their best interests and should be welcome into their community? Or, in other words, how will you work against NIMBYism? Good luck.
Is Michael Kotick here by chance? He is? No, I'm reminded in a debate early on in the Democratic side where Michael Kotick had a question where the question took longer than the time he had allotted to answer it. Listen, this is a really complex issue, and I think it's really important that we not just look at pieces of the puzzle, we have to look at the entire puzzle. And the first part of the puzzle when it comes to housing affordability is the fact that we have a declining middle class. If you do not have good middle class jobs, then housing affordability is exasperated because people simply can't afford to live there. Right now, we have 3 individuals in our country whose cumulative wealth equals the bottom 50% of the United States. This wealth disparity is continuing to separate. And what do we have to do there? We have to invest in opportunities to create new jobs, new industries. And as a member of Congress, I would fight to bring back federal dollars to create those jobs here. We have to get the minimum wage up to where it deserves to be in these areas. I support indexing a $15 minimum wage for the area because people deserve to have livable wages. So that helps address the need for housing, because under Section 8, as an example, Section 8 is tied to the median home price, the median renter's price, and obviously if you have a shortage in housing, then you're going to have greater demands, right? And if people aren't making a livable wage, then their need for Section 8 vouchers becomes greater. So let's start with rebuilding the middle class. Let's start with getting the minimum wage up to at least a minimum where it should be based on inflation, which would put it at $10.70 versus where it is right now. We also need to recognize that housing affordability is also impacted by the ability to build homes where people work. And that also ties back into our infrastructure issues. So when we get upset about every traffic jam we deal with on a daily basis, remember a lot of that's being driven because people can't live where they work. So all of these issues are interrelated, including homelessness. And homelessness, am I allowed to go over 60 seconds? Since I checked with Dana, he said I could have his time on this issue. So if it's okay. Yeah. Okay. homelessness is an issue that's very important to my wife and I. And unlike Representative Rohrabacher, who believes that's a lifestyle choice, my wife and I, when we were in our 20s, built a shelter for homeless families. Because at that time, and in many places across our country still, you lose your job, you lose your house, you stay in a motel, you run out of money, and then you make that decision of going to a shelter where in many places they take the men and the older boys and send them to the men's shelter, and then women and small children to the women's shelter, when all they have at this point in their life is each other. And we know separating families, whether they are homeless or coming to us at the border, is just simply wrong. So what we... So I'll tell you a very quick story. I was with Billy O'Connell at his shelter for homeless women and their children. And this woman comes in, and she said, "You don't remember me. I was here years and years ago with my daughter." And she came in with a big advertising leather portfolio. And she said, "I was in the title business and the real estate business in 2008, and I lost my job. I was diagnosed with a medical condition shortly after that. We lost everything. We ended up on the street." And then she pulls out, and she said, "But you guys brought me in." And she pulls out the diploma that her daughter received from Duke University, right? Really cool. Then pulls out the trophy for being one of the top 10 athletes in the ACC. And then pulls out her admittance letter to Cambridge University in England. And this woman did not make a lifestyle choice to be on the streets. She was meeting unfortunate circumstances, and somebody took care of her. But in an ideal world, she would have had health care insurance. She never would have had to go through that ordeal or put her daughter through that ordeal, and that's what we need to fight for.
Good evening. My name is Tracy, and I'm a member of Orange County Quakers, Orange County Friends meeting. And my question is about health care. Faith communities believe laws are one of the ways we implement our values, and our Constitution declares the government is responsible for promoting the general welfare. We hope that you'll agree that good health is the essence of a society's general welfare. The following is the United Methodist Church statement on health care. Quote, "Providing the care needed to maintain health, prevent disease, and restore health after injury or illness is the responsibility each person owes others and the government owes to all, a responsibility government ignores at its own peril." In Ezekiel 34:4, God points out the failings of the leadership of Israel to care for the weak, saying, "You have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, and as a result, all suffer." Unitarian Universalists, on the other hand, affirm the worth and dignity of every individual and believe that the state should provide equal access, adequate preventative care, and comprehensive treatment for all people. We in the faith community are concerned that healthcare access is being undermined by those who need it, for those who need it the most. Lower income families, individuals with pre-existing conditions, young adults, and especially women in underserved areas who seek essential services from Planned Parenthood. The current administration seems to be working actively to remove protections for 130 million Americans living with pre-existing conditions. They're also working to give insurance companies the ability to charge higher rates to seniors and to eliminate coverage for those suffering from mental illnesses and substance abuse disorders. The Congressional Budget Office's own independent analysis shows that 24 million Americans will lose their health care coverage by 2026 if the current legislation is passed. Instead of limiting access to health care, we feel our representatives should work to expand health care coverage because employer-based health insurance doesn't cover everyone. For example, a dear friend of mine, a hairstylist who supports herself and her disabled husband, is worried she will be unable to afford her essential thyroid medication if she loses her access to Medicaid. The faith community asserts that health care is a right and that every woman, man, and child residing in the United States is entitled to it. Mr. Rouda, could you affirm that health care is a right and that everyone is entitled to it? And would you support universal health care, and how would you implement that?
Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to answer this question with a little bit of background because I think it's really important that we understand how healthcare works in the United States. There's roughly 200 countries in the world. Of those 200 countries, 40 of them are industrialized developed countries. Of those 40 industrialized developed countries, 39 of them have universal health care. Only one does not. That would be the greatest, richest, most powerful country in the history of the world, the United States of America. Those 200 countries follow typically one of 4 plans. The first plan is called the beverage model. It was started in England. It's where the government owns the hospital. The staff, nurses, and doctors all work for the government. The second model is the Bismarck model. It was started in Germany. And that is where the employers and the employees provide the funding mechanism for universal health care for the citizens of those countries. And that's what we recognize here, right? With 2 key differences. Those countries that follow that model, they are, that funding mechanism between employers and employees provides health care for everyone, not just the employees and their families. And the underwriters are nonprofit versus for-profit like we have here in the country. The third model is what's typically called the national model. That's what Canada and many other countries follow. It's just a national tax that provides health care for everyone. And then there's a fourth model, which is no model at all. You either pay for health care services when you receive them, you barter for them, or you go without them. Ironically, the United States has all 4 models. The first model, where the government owns the hospitals and everybody works for it, that's Veteran Affairs. The second model, I talked about. We're familiar with that, the employer-employee model. The third model, that's Medicare. And for 30 million Americans, we have the fourth model, which is no insurance at all. This is why we spend 18.5% of our GDP on health care, which is twice as much as those other industrialized developed countries, which you'd probably say, well, Harley, we must have the healthiest people in the world. And I would tell you, no, we don't. Unfortunately, we tend to be in the bottom quartile in all major metrics in this area. Inability to pay medical bills, as I referenced in the last question, is a leading cause of homelessness in our country, and the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. So we know we've got a problem. So what do? First thing we do is we allow individuals, families, and businesses to buy into Medicare. Medicare has proven they can provide quality services at 65 cents on the dollar compared to private insurance. If you want to buy private insurance, buy private insurance. If you want to buy in Medicare, buy in Medicare. Second, reinstate the individual mandate. Third, take the shackles off of Medicare's ability to negotiate big pharma prices, especially for our seniors. And fourth, keep working to get as much fraud out of the system as possible. And while she's coming over here, I'll tell you one more thing. We already have universal health care in the least efficient way possible. It's at the ER instead of preventively, right? Hi, how are you?
Good evening. I'm Grace Lawrenson, and I'm from the Unitarian Universalist Church. And 3 years ago, I was standing on a street corner holding a sign saying, "Stop climate change." I believed what the scientists were saying about carbon emissions and global warming, but I didn't know what to do about it. I felt a little bit helpless. And recent situations have been confirming that the scientific predictions are now coming true, and the urgency is becoming more critical. We see water evaporating from the oceans, causing the hurricanes to be bigger, especially with the amount of water that they're dropping. We see that this year with Florence. And then, of course, the drought, warm air makes the water evaporate from the land, and we get droughts. But then the air evaporates and it falls down someplace else, and we get floods. And drought makes our forests more flammable, and the hot air makes the fires hotter and harder to put out. Some good news, on the other hand, is that California has already met its greenhouse gas reduction goal for 2020. So progress is being made, very slowly, it is being made, and while still growing the economy, and that's the key point. One of the issues is it's not going to grow the economy. Solar and wind power are getting cheaper. Did you know that the Coal Mining Museum in Kentucky has solar panels for their electricity?
I did not know that.
More good news. In 2016, Congressman Curbelo, a Republican, and Deutsch, a Democrat, started the Climate Solutions Caucus. Gradually, 2 by 2, representatives have been joining. Now, 43 Republicans and 43 Democrats in the U.S. Congress have committed to talking about climate change. Now, back to the downside, fewer than 50% of the people in the United States discuss global warming at least occasionally. This is from a recent Yale University study. Any state shown in blue on this map has less than 50% of those surveyed discussing climate change, even occasionally. You'll note, this means that over half of our citizens are not even talking about global warming. This matters. We have to talk about climate change to find solutions. So, Harley, our question for you is, if elected, what steps, if any, would you take to try to further break down the silence surrounding climate change? And second, which of the following approaches do you see as having the best chance of overcoming partisan gridlock? Choices are regulation, subsidies, or carbon pricing.
Grace, right?
Grace, yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I agree, Grace. This is the #1 issue facing humankind. And I'm very different in positions than Representative Rohrabacher, who has called climate change a global fraud and supports offshore drilling off our beautiful coastline, which I do not support either. Let me tell you why this is the #1 issue facing humankind. Where we have built our homes and our cities and our farms are all based on predictable weather patterns over the last 1,000+ years. And when you heat up the earth, as we are doing, you change those predictable weather patterns in a matter of what could be 2 or 3 generations. So where we have built our homes, our cities, and farms are literally obsolete. This is an infrastructure issue beyond the widening of the 405. This is, some estimates are putting 200 million climate refugees by the year 2050. 2050, we're talking 32 years from now. That'll be the biggest mass migration of people on our planet since World War II. There will be wars, there will be famine, there will be unthinkable carnage as the world deals with climate change. So we have to address it. And you've certainly laid out several ways we can do it. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think all of them have to be on the table. We have to provide incentives because there's an opportunity here. Here's the opportunity. I truly believe, I'm optimistic about humankind addressing this issue. We have to, or we will be extinct. So if we're going to address it, the way to address it is provide opportunities to create new tech, clean energy industries that help address this issue on a global footprint. And let's build those industries right here in Southern California. Let's make sure that our tax code is promoting clean tech and clean energy and renewables instead of fossil fuels. For every dollar that we have going towards renewables right now in tax incentives, we've had $80 for fossil fuels. It's backwards, guys. We got to get that flipped around. We've got to get committed to making sure that we are creating the solutions and the jobs to address this important issue. And yeah, I'm proud of the fact that we were recently endorsed by the Orange County firefighters. They recognize climate change is a huge issue. They're dealing with it with the fires that you talked about. The Defense Department recognizes this is the #1 threat issue for us long-term to conduct security and safety for the United States. And if anybody has any doubt that climate change is real and happening, I suggest you go to Balboa Island. And on Balboa Island, you can walk across around the island, and there's a wall to prevent you from falling into the bay. They just raised the height of it. They didn't raise the height of it because people were falling into the bay. They raised the height of it because tides are getting larger, more aggressive, storms are getting bigger, and the issues are becoming even greater for us. It's the number one issue we have to address to save humankind. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jan. In recent years, our nation's policy toward immigrants has been brutal. More than 2 million people were deported during President Obama's tenure, setting a record. President Trump has gone way beyond welcoming, stating he wants all immigrants without legal status to be deported. He wants to redefine what it means to be legal. Yet we are a nation of immigrants, built by and for immigrants. Generations of people who call themselves immigrants have made Orange County what it is today, people from all over the world. But communities here in the 48th District are hurting. Instead of working to fix a flawed immigration system in which there's really no such thing as a line, Congress has focused on tougher enforcement measures that criminalize and hurt our communities. I reached out to leaders in Oakview Comunidad in Huntington Beach and also to immigrant communities here in Costa Mesa, and they verified that many see family and friends being targeted by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They love their communities and they want them to flourish. What they really want is a representative who will listen to them. Yes, we passed Senate Bill 54 in California, making us a sanctuary state. But here in Orange County, several cities, including Costa Mesa and Huntington Beach, have come out against that bill. And our communities are even more fearful. As people of faith, we are also disturbed by the recent ban on refugees and visitors from some Muslim-majority countries. We support not decreasing, as happened again yesterday, but increasing numbers of new refugees and asylum seekers. One of our church leaders is a refugee from Chile. Cosme?
My name is Goodwin-Noriega. The government of the United States currently is denying due process to many people requesting asylum or seeking some kind of protection, and this reminds me of my personal experience. 4 decades ago, I was defined as a danger to national security. I was arrested without a warrant, tortured, put in solitary confinement for a month, and transferred to a concentration camp without the right to trial. It happened in my country of Chile during the dictatorship that was planned and sustained by the Nixon administration in an absolute denial of due process. Upon Nixon's resignation, the United States Senate pushed the new administration to acknowledge the systemic abuse of fundamental human rights in Chile. As a result of this admission of complicity, the United States granted me and 400 other political prisoners asylum. We were flown straight from concentration camp to various parts of the United States. Thank you.
As human beings, we are called here to be with love and compassion. A fair immigration system is needed now more than ever, but in spite of bipartisan support, has failed to pass both houses of Congress. What are 3 things you will do to fight for in a comprehensive immigration bill? And do you support full funding for the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program?
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your story with us, because it epitomizes what so many people come to our shores in hopes of finding a better life, security, a chance to escape the torture and abuse that they have experienced in their home country. And all of us are very proud to have you share that with us. Thank you. To answer that first question, what are the major issues in immigration reform? I like to be pragmatic in my thinking. And I would like to take everybody to 2013 Senate Bill 744. This was a bill that was passed by the Senate of the United States of America by 68 to 32 margin. Again, can't emphasize enough the bipartisan support, including members of southern border states from the Republican Party, Jeff Flake and the late, great John McCain. And also Lindsey Graham was on that as well, and Marco Rubio, and then 4 Democrats. That was the Great Eight, and the Gang of Eight, excuse me. In that legislation, they had comprehensive immigration reform on the table for the House ready to sign it and Obama ready to sign it into law. It provided $46 billion for port and border security, not a wall, but fencing, aerial control, and new Border Patrol agents. It provided also support for our ports because half of the undocumented individuals in our country did not come from the southern border. They came through our airports. It also provided a pathway to citizenship for everybody that was here, I believe, since 2008 prior, including DACA, provided they had no violent felonies, they paid any back taxes, and so on. And it also redid the visa process to make sure that people who were creating jobs here did not have their visas revoked and were sent back to their home country. This is what democracy is supposed to be, where you actually have people from both sides of the aisle working together to solve a comprehensive issue. It went to the House of Representatives, and it, as I mentioned, it had a majority support from the House, and the Tea Party told Boehner, if you let it out of committee onto the floor, you will no longer be Speaker. It never made it to the floor of the House where it had support and would have gone to President Obama's desk for signature. So I'm hopeful that we can get that legislation back on the table because I believe that legislation has the required bipartisan support we need if we want to see it get passed. And I will work very hard to do that. And then the second question, do you support full funding for the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program? Yes, I do. I believe the United States has the same obligation as other countries around the world to meet the needs of refugees across the world and to live up to the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. Thank you.
So we do have a fair bit of time left, and Mr. Rouda, are you willing to take questions from the floor that are cold, as it were? So, okay, so we put them in order here. So the first question for you is, when you get to Congress, what is the most important issue you will address and why?
Excuse me for a Marco Rubio moment here. You know, the most important issue is climate change. I talked about that earlier. That's an issue that I'm fully supportive of getting in as much as I, thank you. We've got to get that addressed. We also need to make sure that we get economic fairness back on the table so that people have an opportunity at the American dream. The American dream used to be that if you worked hard, you could own a house and put your kids through college. And now we've got 2 people in the house working 2 jobs each and struggling to even make rent the next month. That's just plain wrong. So we've got to get those addressed by having economic opportunity available. But the first piece of legislation I've committed to signing, and the reason I've committed to making this first is because I am incredibly frustrated with our current president's constant efforts to divide us as a people. I believe as a country, our diversity is what makes us great. And as such, I have committed the first piece of legislation I'll add my name to is the Equality Act.
Just wave your hand. So, Mr. Rouda, what is your... Okay, Harley. Hey, I'm Sean. So, Mr. Rouda, what is your plan going forward? I didn't even... oh, sorry. It says Mr. Rouda. I'm just quoting. Harley, what is your plan going forward to deal with Orange County's opioid and sober living out-of-control situation?
Yeah, it's, and again, there's another clear difference between Representative Rohrabacher and me. He submitted a piece of legislation recently to address the sober home issue. Is everybody familiar with the sober home issue? Homes dedicated to addressing addictions, some of them very reputable, many of them not. And the legislation he submitted to address that, the first part of it is eliminating under the ACA money for those who have addictions. So that's his way of eliminating the problem, was eliminating any money for those who have addictions. That's not the issue. The issue is the fly-by-night companies that are taking advantage of the ACA. And in fact, at Costa Mesa, I think Mayor Katrina Foley has told me that there's over 200 sober homes in Costa Mesa. Clearly, we don't need 200 sober homes. So we got to tighten it up. We know that these homes are recruiting people from other parts of the country to come here, receive 6 months of benefits, not great benefits. They're pocketing much of that money and putting them on the street to add to our drug issues and our homelessness issues. And so we do need to give municipalities the ability to have proper zoning that is not eviscerated by the American with Disabilities Act that's allowing these homes to be placed in the community. And if we can get that changed, that would give the municipalities greater control over making sure that not too many permits are issued, and second, that there's appropriate accountability and transparency with these companies that are providing these services to make sure we're holding them accountable to help those who need help. They're at the lowest point in their life, right, trying to fight an addiction and become part of society again, and here we are having these companies take advantage of them at that point in time. It's wrong.
I also want to mention that because you mentioned Katrina Foley, she will be here later this evening. So I understand she's going to arrive about 8 o'clock, but should be out in the foyer as well. She is the mayor of Costa Mesa and continuing to run. So if you have questions for her. Yes. So, Harley, how can we reduce college debt of millions of Americans? How can we make college more affordable to students and they won't be straddled with debt?
Great question, and please go to harleyforcongress.com. You'll see my position on education. I talk a lot about K through 12 made perfectly good sense post-World War II, but that doesn't cut it today. Today we need P through C and trade school opportunities if we're going to effectively compete in the global stage. We have to have the best educated kids and workforce in the world if we're going to succeed. That means making sure our kids have access to college education in an affordable way. And I even suggest putting in a free college education with a work component for the bottom quartile of socioeconomic 18-year-olds. And let me tell you why. Who here thinks those 18-year-olds, if they went through 4 years of college or a trade school, have a better chance of being in the middle class or higher, right? So they're going to pay more taxes over the next 40 years of their life than they would without that education. That alone will pay for the cost of that education. Second, they will also have less impact on social services, so less taxes need to go to the safety net to protect them. Third, they're going to have more discretionary income. More discretionary income raises every single business across America in our individual communities. And fourth, it breaks the cycle of poverty. So this is a no-brainer to do this, to give these kids an opportunity to move forward. But we also have to address student debt for those that have accumulated student debt. That one is trickier, but I do believe we can create incentives for employers to help create ways to work that debt down in a way that benefits the student who got the education and the employer who's keeping them employed. This is really, I can't emphasize how important it is that we make this investment. And I want to provide something for you to think about. What would the cost be to educate the bottom 25% of 18-year-olds in a four-year nonprofit college university? It's $20 billion. $20 billion a year. The cost in interest on the tax plan that was just passed is $40 billion a year. So we have to ask ourselves, and that's at 2% interest rate, guys. We expect that interest rate to go up. So we have to ask ourselves as Americans, what is important to us? we need to have this discussion, this narrative among ourselves. Do we want to make sure that the richest people in the country get 70% of this tax break, or do we want to make sure that we have the best educated kids in the world? Personally, I'm going to vote for the latter, because I think that's what we need more right now. And guess who agrees with me? The state of New York provides free college education for their 18-year-olds, for those with incomes, parents' incomes up to $150,000, I believe is the number. But you might say, oh, Harley, come on. New York's just like California. You got a blue legislature and a blue governor. Of course they're doing these big spend items, right? Well, guess what? There's another state that's doing it, but they don't have a $150,000 income limit. There is no limit. That's Tennessee. And that's a red legislature and a red governor. Why is Tennessee doing that? Because they recognize whoever has the smartest workforce attracts industries, attracts businesses, and attracts jobs. That's why we do it.
So as a Unitarian Universalist, I love this personal question, but I didn't write it. So Harley, what does religious freedom mean in the, at the federal level in 2018?
Well, you know, for me, I think I guide my days and my weeks by WWJD. And I really enjoyed a lot of these questions up here, because a lot of these questions, to me, are pretty easy questions to answer if you do it in the context of what would our religious leaders expect us to do. And there are basic humanitarian things that we need to support by just being part of the human race. Our Constitution was based on the idea that all people are equal and all religions are free to express themselves. And I would certainly work hard to make sure that happens and continues, and that what we see right now going on occasion with the current administration, whether it's a ban on certain Muslim countries coming to our country, what we're seeing with dealing with the southern border and with refugees, are all things that I believe could be addressed in better ways.
This question is, what is your position on ICE funding, ICE?
I support ICE, and let me tell you why. I don't support some of the things ICE does, but just as a police department has bad actors here and there, you don't eliminate the police department because you've got a bad actor in the police department. You eliminate the bad acts and the bad actors. So they've got a job to do that was promulgated after 9/11, and they need to stick to the original mission that they were given by Congress.
What was that original mission?
It's Homeland Security, and and nowhere in there does it talk about tearing families apart at the southern border.
Let's see here. So this question is, have you always been a Democrat? And if not, can you describe your political journey?
Yes, and no, I haven't been always a Democrat. I tell people, I was a Republican. I was born and raised in a Christian Republican household. And I tell people that typically your political and religious affiliations are given to you at birth. And you may change at some point in your life, but you usually don't change when you're 5 or 6. It's usually when you get a little bit older and more mature. So I left the Republican Party in 1997. And I'd say the biggest reason I left was I married Kara, my wife of 28 years. Who helped me see the light. And and part of that too was, you know, the opportunity for the two of us to build the shelter for homeless families was a tremendous experience for us. And that, coupled with the Republican Party, especially under Karl Rove, just going in a direction that was inconsistent with my principles. That's why I left in 1997.
Thank you for sharing that. So the question from Michael Maxetti, who signed his first question is, how will you work to break the gridlock in Congress?
Great question. So let me approach that two ways. One, me personally, and two, what I think needs to be actually done. From day one, my campaign slogan has been common sense for common ground. I decided to run for office because I was frustrated with both parties. I was frustrated with both parties putting party first, country second. I truly believe most Americans are between the 20-yard lines. I believe there's so much more we have in common than what separates us, and that we need to focus on what we have in common and work to get that done. Go to Congress, go to the state legislature, go to your city council meetings, fight for what you believe in, but at the end of the day, find where the common ground is and put country and community first. Then, if you do that, we will move our country in the right direction. Now, I also recognize that's a bit of a Pollyannish viewpoint in light of what we see in today's Congress. And let me share two statistics with you one's from 1978, one's from 1982. I can't remember which is which, so we'll just say 1980. And if you looked at the Senate that George H. Bush was in, and if you looked at the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, you would have found 56 senators falling in that gap. 56. What do we call those people? Yeah, moderates, centrists, exactly. Today, and for 5 years straight, there hasn't been one. That same time period, they voted with their party 60% of the time. Today, it's around 95% of the time. So what's happened? What's happened that we've become so polarized? Well, I think it's a confluence of a few things. One, Citizens United was a horrible decision by the Supreme Court. That's a decision where corporations are people too. Has anybody ever been to a corporation's birthday party? Anybody ever made out with a corporation? Yeah? Okay. So when that decision was made, there was approximately $140 million of dark, soft money that was coming into the election system. Today, it's $1.6 billion in the 2016 election. In fact, as I stand here right now, in this political cycle, 1 out of every 10 ads on TV have been funded by the Koch brothers. So that's not democracy. So what we're seeing is that dark money coming in. Second, gerrymandering at the congressional level. Gerrymandering forces, whether it's gerrymandered by the Democrats or gerrymandered by the Republicans, you tend to get the folks that are on the farthest ends of the political spectrum going to Congress and not willing to reach across the aisle. Actually, what we have here in California, as much as the jungle primary is a challenge, it does force candidates to work a little bit more towards the middle. And then third is social media. You know, social media, the second word there is media. And social media, for many of us, has become our news. And that news because of Russian manipulation or just because we want to be in an echo chamber that constantly reinforces the message we want to hear that supports our viewpoint, doesn't allow us to hear other people across the aisle and understand a different viewpoint. So we got to get back to what our founders wanted, and that is fight for what you believe in, but listen. I like this guy's shirt right here, read, think, talk. And I think you could also say it could be listen, think, and talk, and vote. Because you're never going to change somebody else's mind if you're not willing to listen and willing to talk to them and find the common ground.
I have a little bit of a follow-up question, but I also want to make sure other people get their questions answered as well. But the follow-up question that Michael's asked you is asking about rule changes within Congress that might encourage bipartisan support. Do you support any rule changes there?
Yeah, I think it's the Hasford rule that the Republicans put in that if a majority of the caucus doesn't support a piece of legislation, they never let it to the floor. When I talked about Senate Bill 744, that was one of the reasons that Boehner cited, even though there was no statistical evidence to show that a majority of the Republicans weren't going to support the bill on the floor. So that's something I think it needs to be overturned. But that's a caucus decision. I'm sure there's a ton of other rules, but as was pointed out, I've never run for office before. I'm trying, as corny as it sounds, trying to serve the greater good, go do my job, come back and be a citizen again. So I know I have a lot to learn.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I know a lot of these rules need to be changed.
So are you planning to work on Dreamer's legal situation? What is your plan or your proposition?
Yes, and as I stated earlier when we talked about comprehensive immigration reform, that's certainly an important component of it. And it's also a part that I'm very frustrated with, to some degree with both parties, because I feel like Dreamers have been held hostage to the political process, and it's unfair. These individuals clearly don't know any other country but the United States. Many of them have served in our military, serving in our communities, are running businesses. They're with us on a daily basis. Yet to suggest, as Representative Rohrabacher would suggest, that every single person in the United States who is not a citizen should be deported is asinine. I can't say it any other way than that. Yeah, there's overwhelming support across America, majority of Americans who believe Dreamers should have a pathway to citizenship. End of discussion. We need to make it happen.
And Harley, what is your position on supporting the LGBT community, especially our youth who are committing suicide at an increasing and alarming rate?
Two things. As I stated earlier about signing the Equality Act being the first bill I would add my name to, but I want to emphasize that we can pass all the legislation we want to address LGBTQ issues, and that's only half the job. Because if we don't change hearts and minds across America, then that legislation is just covering up sentiment that's not being properly addressed. And we've seen some bad sentiment rise up with the current administration. So what's it require? It requires all of us as individuals and leaders to make sure that we are fighting for equality for all in our country, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's any other minorities, whether it's women. We need to fight to make sure that we're representing everyone. And I do believe that starts with not just our political leadership, but business leaders, academia, clergy, and others to make sure that we are standing by and helping our fellow man and woman and brother and sister.
Thank you. So this person writes, if I can decipher their handwriting, I teach at Orange Coast College just down the road from here, and I'm terrified for my present and future students as I watch Betsy DeVos and the Trump administration work to make education a privilege for the wealthy rather than a right for all. What are some of your positions on public education, including the possibility of free community college education for all who want to learn?
Thank you. I think I covered that probably after that person wrote it. I think you're pretty clear where I am on education. We have to recognize that the idea of taking taxpayer dollars and privatizing schools across America is not good for America. The public school system is what's made our country great. Can we make our public school system better? Hell yes. One way is pay teachers what they deserve. That would go a long way. Continue to fight to make sure that, again, our kids in school have the best technology. They have the opportunities with STEAM that is so important. I add an A for architecture and arts to the typical STEM definition. And making sure that our kids are well equipped for the jobs of tomorrow. There's some study out there where I think it's around 70 or 80% of the jobs that kids being born today, they're not even in existence, most of those jobs. So we know what we have to do. We have to have a very a robust educational system that can move very quickly. And one other thing I'll add on this too is they also need to be able to show up in school and be able to study and work and learn in a gun-free environment. And now, Representative Rohrabacher, as many of you know, was on This Is America, a Showtime episode where he stated that he supported the training and arming of students in school. And the comedian used the term kindergartens. Now, as appalling as that sounds, it must have seemed appalling to Representative Rohrabacher because he wanted to put out a press statement afterwards to clarify what he meant. And his clarification was he was only talking high school students being armed and trained, and that there would be a limited number of guns available on the school site for their use in need of an emergency.
Thank you. So this question is Social Security an entitlement, and how can we maintain and improve Social Security?
Yes, Social Security is at risk. Part of the tax scam plan that I mentioned earlier was to use the increased deficit as a reason to start taking shots at Medicare and Social Security and reducing the benefits there. In fact, towards that end, Donald Trump just, I think about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, said that the cost of living raise for federal workers would not be implemented due to the increased federal deficit. That'd be the increased federal deficit that he created. So we see where this is going, and it's just simply unfair. Our seniors deserve to retire in dignity. They deserve to be able to live in dignity, and they deserve to have the health care that allows them to live in dignity.
Getting back to some of the civil rights, will you claim a stand on the bathroom bills that are passing against the transgender community?
I laugh because I think this is just the silliest discussion, because every bathroom in my house is transgender. It doesn't matter. It's gender-free. I do know one thing. I better put the toilet seat down, though, after I use the bathroom. Look, this is just an issue that is being used to divide us away from what's important. If we really think this is the most important issue, do we think infrastructure is important? Do we think climate change is important? Do we think creating middle-class jobs is important? Do we think women's rights are important? Do we think immigration needs to be solved? All of these issues I would rather focus on than these issues that are placed in front of us in an attempt to divide us.
How can Congress, especially the House, combat the repercussions of landmark Supreme Court cases being overturned by a new majority taking over, namely Roe versus Wade and gay marriage?
Well, there's one way. That is, elect Democrats to a majority in the House, to a majority in the Senate, and in the White House, and we can pass legislation to address these issues. Now, I think we got to be realistic, too, that the Supreme Court has a history and tradition of honoring precedent. And while we don't know what the current court will do with existing precedent, I'm hopeful that they will continue to follow that precedent. That being said, though, I'm concerned. I'm concerned that there are things such as a woman's right not necessarily having Roe v. Wade overturned, but allowing states to chip away at it. I think that's where the real concern is going to lie, and that's why if we want to address this, we need to address it in Congress and the White House.
Mr. Rouda, we have a lot of questions here, but you've been incredibly gracious, and you've been standing up there for quite some time. I'd like to give you an opportunity and maybe a little bit more time than we originally had planned to end with some closing statements for everyone here.
Sure, thank you. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity with Representative Rohrabacher to be here with you today. At least in name. And guys, it's so important that we actually do this in our communities, that your elected officials and those who want to serve you show up and talk to you, hear your questions, and provide answers. So we've asked Dana Rohrabacher to debate me, and he could have easily come here to do it, and unfortunately he hasn't. But my commitment to you, if elected, is I will continue to have town halls just like I've been having virtually every month since I announced I was running for Congress. I think that's important. I think it's most important to do that when there's key legislation in front of Congress, to be able to sit down, talk to you, and understand, because truly, for many people, these can be life and death situations and decisions, and we need your input. So my commitment is to continually work with you, communicate with you, and seek your input and guidance in what is important. And I really want to thank all of you for allowing, I know it was a lot of hard work to put this together, and those who prepared the questions, thank you, and some of the experiences you shared were truly heartbreaking, to be honest, to understand that this country stands for so much. This country has been the beacon of hope for the world for decades and decades, and certainly since World War II, the leader of the free world and the leader of the world. We need to continue to be that leader. That leader certainly includes elements of strength, but it also includes elements of empathy and compassion. That's what makes America great, strength and compassion. And I'm committed to taking those attributes, those characters, traits to Washington, D.C. and doing my best to serve you. Thanks for having me.